Okay, here we are with part 4, the final part of chapter 9. First, we're going to start with price regulations, restrictions on competition, price regulations. What price regulations deal with is the government setting the price of a particular item. Well, this, as with most government regulation, doesn't work. The book discusses this as well. Quite simply, price regulation creates price floors, price ceilings for specific items, and that creates surpluses and shortages. It doesn't work. For the most part, we moved away from it, but there are certain situations where it does, where the government still does set prices, specifically through its own subsidiaries. You look at the post office. Supply and demand doesn't dictate post office rates. It does dictate the rates for UPS and FedEx. So UPS and FedEx set their prices according to market demand. And guess what? They sell. They do well. They sell a lot of product. The post office does not, and it's $1 billion in debt every year. That's what happens when the government sets prices as opposed to the market dictating. Because if the market dictated what it would cost to send a letter, it would be a lot more, to be honest. It would be a lot more, and they'd have more income. But because it's the government, people say, oh, they can afford more. They can afford to take some of the cost, which is, of course, you paying the cost in taxes. But that isn't often thought through, and people fight for every penny. It's inefficient, doesn't work. The example I'm going to use is the Chevy Volt. Remember, the government owns GM, Chevrolet for the most part, and makes the decisions. And the Chevy Volt is a car that may never have come out if Chevy maintained ownership of the company, because the cost to make the car dictated that the price be over $40,000, and there was no demand for that car at $40,000. The numbers didn't make any sense. But when the government took over, they say, hey, they got this Volt car. It meets the agenda of the current presidential administration, so we're going to release it, and that way we'll be heroes. We're going to put out this new environmentally friendly car. Well, didn't work out too well because they set the price so high, and anybody who can do math said this car isn't worth it. Yeah, it gets a little bit better mileage, and you have the electric option for a little bit, but it's basically a Chevy Cruze with the electric option. You can get a Chevy Cruze for what, $16,000, something like that. In the Volt, they wanted over $40,000. Well, the payoff on the Volt, depending on how much you drive and the cost of gas, could be anywhere from 15 to 20 years. It's going to take that long for the savings in gas to make it worth it to buy the Volt over the Cruze. And it's the exact same car on the inside and the outside. I mean, it's the same platform. People know this. Cruze, the Chevy Cruze, which was developed under market demand conditions, sold through the roof. It's the #1 new selling car in the whole country. And the Volt couldn't sell enough to warrant production, and they stopped production on the car. They'll probably bring it back. As long as the government's in charge, they won't admit defeat. But it's going away because nobody bought it. It didn't make any sense. And because the market didn't dictate the price, the government dictated the price. If the market dictated the price, it probably would have been in the mid to high 20s, competitive with a Prius, maybe a little bit more since it had the plug-in option, maybe a little more than the Prius. But because it costs more than that to make and develop, Chevy may never have released it, but the government decided to, and it was a failure as a result. Price regulation simply does not work. Only the market will dictate prices that will be successful for the manufacturers and companies that are selling products. Finally, antitrust legislation. Antitrust legislation really started with the Sherman Antitrust Act, and then you had the Federal Trade Commission Act and the Clayton Act that followed a few years later. And antitrust legislation basically it eliminated monopolies, and it eliminated collusion and cartels, which we already discussed. So they decided monopolies were bad. The government decided this. And so they passed laws against it. Basically, this is another situation. If they didn't like the rich people getting too rich, regardless of the concept of what it meant for everybody else, they didn't want rich people getting too rich, because rich people, with money comes power, and rich people can then actually start to assert government types levels of power, especially back in the robber baron days at the turn of the last century. The rich people were extremely rich in proportion to the size of the government, and actually could manipulate the government in many ways. The government didn't like this, and they said, nope, you can't have any monopolies. However, from a purely economic standpoint, the legislation, the antitrust legislation, really isn't very effective. They've convinced us all that monopolies are a bad thing. But remember, the market dictates demand. The person selling, and therefore the price. The person selling doesn't dictate the price. If the price is too high for what the monopolist is selling, people aren't going to buy it. They're going to find a substitute, create a substitute, innovate a substitute, or just walk away from that type of product altogether. It simply doesn't work. If somebody were to be the only cell phone provider in the country, the only cell phone service provider in the country, and they started charging $1,000 a month, would you pay it? Probably not. Something else would come up. Somebody would innovate something new. We'd all go back to landlines. We'd go back to pagers, whatever it may be. But if the price is too high, you're simply not going to buy the product. Somebody else is going to come along and create something that is more efficient. A new cell phone provider would pop up real quick if somebody was overcharging by that much. The markets, by and large, are very efficient. And when a monopolist is manipulating the situation, something else comes up, and they tend to be eliminated. And that's really how monopolies work. There have been good monopolies that have been very beneficial. You look at U.S. Steel. They did a great job for a long time. They charged reasonable prices. They provided lots of jobs. They charged at the market price because they had to, and they made a lot of money, and that was good for all around. Once again, the government often doesn't like that, because they like to be considered responsible for all successful economic activity, and they can't claim responsibility for that. But once again, for the most part, monopolies are not harmful. They don't hurt anything, and the antitrust legislation really hasn't been very effective in that area. The book says many of the same. All economic books say the same thing on monopolies, basically, that they get a bad rap for the most part. All right, that should do it. Please participate in the discussion, and we'll see you next week.